more embarrassed. The fingers trembled slightly from the tension and did not obey the blue-eyed girl at all, who was trying to fasten the jewelry and was already reproaching herself for this stupid idea. Rush suddenly whispered her name and softly thanked her for saving his dear Laurel estate. Looking at his wife with sincere respect and even pride, the Archduke declared that he would always be grateful to her for this act. Blushing even more than before, Syria opened her eyes, not expecting to hear such words from the usually stern and reserved man. Their breaths mingled again, and they were close to kissing, but the girl suddenly pulled back and said that the necklace did not suit him at all. Rush smiled softly at her modesty and said with a smile that it would be as she wished. Stroking the large ruby, the blue-eyed woman asked him if he knew that this pendant contained divine power. The fair-haired man objected that it was indeed a relic, but hardly an unusual one, and the girl assured him that this decoration had much more power than its usual value. He said that this explained why Syria was so pleased, but she asked if there was anything else he wanted to say. Picking up the item, the blue-eyed woman repeated that it was a very precious and powerful thing, and therefore he should demand that it be returned. Rush hummed thoughtfully and took the pendant in his hand, put it to his lips, and then said that he didn't have a habit of taking back his gifts. Pulling the girl a little closer to himself, the man gently noted that the thing looked much better on his wife. Syria blushed brightly, realizing that for the first time a man was treating her with such attention and care, courting and respecting her. Immediately embarrassed by her own thoughts and feelings, she jumped up and said that she must resume checking the glacier next week, but the Archduke asked if she really wanted to monopolize all the work of his servants. Turning around, the girl said that this suited her and declared that she really liked it when people did not despise her. The man looked at the blue-eyed woman in surprise when she asked if it was the same with him. He muttered something unintelligible without taking his eyes off his wife, and she asked him again what he had said. Rush calmly explained that Syria had completely changed and that it was strange, and when the girl tried to find out what exactly the blonde guy thought was strange, he changed the subject and said that they could go back to the house. The next day, in the prison building, the Archduke said that he did not understand at all why his wife would see a prisoner who was being tortured. Turning to her husband, the girl said that it seemed to her that these shamans had come to the Laurel estate for a reason, but with a special purpose. Looking at the mages lying on the cold stone floor, the blue-eyed girl muttered that their condition was much more decent than she expected. When Lenin said that the Burke's methods of dealing with prisoners were not so cruel, Syria stepped closer to the cell, calling out to the shaman, and held out the tiara, asking if he had come for it. The man's eyes lit up with an evil fire, and he rushed towards the iron bars, and Rush quickly pushed his wife away, shielding her from possible trouble. When the prisoner opened his mouth and wanted to say something, bloody teeth literally poured out of his mouth. Quickly gathering everything so as not to frighten the lady, Lenin muttered that he had ordered them all several times to keep their mouths shut. As he stuffed them back into the prisoner's mouth, the assistant sang that he was frightening the Archduchess, while the girl asked in surprise if they really were teeth. Rush pulled her towards the exit, and the girl protested, reminding him of the words about them not using harsh methods. Later, in his husband's office, Syria listened to a conversation between him and Elliot about how they assumed Mitchell was to blame for what happened, and that his approach was much harsher than they thought. The Archduke slapped his knee and called him a scoundrel, saying that he had been furious when he had discovered that he was an illegitimate son, and asked him if he thought that the destruction of the House of Burke would change the fact of his birth. Blue-eyed remembered that Brother Rush was their father's favorite, and now, having learned that it was he who sent the magicians, she decided that he had really gone crazy. Scratching her nose thoughtfully, she looked down and wondered what he could possibly need the family heirloom for. Noticing her expression, the Archduke smiled and assured his wife that he was not hiding any illegitimate children. Syria replied that she knew this very well, because she was sure that he would never do such a thing. Immediately remembering Elliot's presence and their strange glances, Rush asked if anything had happened between them, since they both seemed strange. The girl hesitated, muttering something indistinctly, and then laughed nervously while the knight looked away in embarrassment. In the morning, a little later after Syria woke up, something not very significant, but very interesting actually happened. Sir Elliot came to her chambers and fell on his knees before his lady, saying that his life and honor belonged to the Laurel estate. He burst into tears right in front of her, saying that after saving his soul and this place, he completely entrusted his life and honor into the hands of the Archduchess. Syria was not surprised by the deep feelings awakened in him, but these tears still came as a great surprise and revelation to both of them. Becoming much more serious, Rush looked at Elliot jealously and asked what the hell could have happened. Their conversation and the growing tension were interrupted by Lennon, who burst in and loudly called for His Majesty from the corridor. Breathing heavily and resting his hands on his knees, the assistant said that a group of priests, including the high priest, went to the Supreme Church, but they were caught in a snowstorm and monsters. The Archduke sat silently as Lennon said that Saint Lena and the Marquis of Hanet were also in the procession. Syria froze when she heard that they had received an urgent message asking for help from the Archduchess, her husband, and a squad of knights. Rubbing his face with his hand, Rush asked how serious it was, and when Lennon replied that it was unknown, he stood up and asked to tell them that they all died of cold together. Walking forward, the man said that if they really needed help, let the knights, led by Elliot, go to help. Blue Eyes wondered if the Archduke might refuse to avoid putting her in a difficult position, but she knew that such behavior could have a negative impact on the Burke household. Syria clenched her fingers and thought that she had sworn to do everything possible for his well-being, and now she could not allow hostility with the High Church. Calling out to his lordship, the girl said that they had better help the procession, which was in danger. The husband asked if she was sure, and when the girl said that the high priest himself was calling her, the man, surprising Elliot and Lennon, calmly said that he could come up with dozens of excuses. Leaning toward his wife, Rush said with a soft smile and concern that she didn't have to go there at all. Unexpectedly for everyone, the gentleman, with the same slight smile, knelt down on one knee in front of his wife. Extending his palm towards her, the man said that if such a request did not embarrass Syria, he offered to go there with him. The girl blushed brightly, looking at Rush, and then took his hand and nodded in agreement. She stood up, looking at the Archduke with a gentle smile, and told Rush in a somewhat reassuring tone that they would go there together. After some time, the servants informed the high priest that His Grace Archduke Burke and his wife, Syria Stern, had arrived at the scene with a detachment of knights. High Priest Amos, a middle-aged man with deep green eyes, thanked the master for responding to his request for help. Placing his hand on his chest, he greeted the Archduke's wife, and she, with a slight stutter, greeted him in return. The man said with a smile that she had grown up a lot, and then admitted that this was a big surprise for him, and the blue-eyed girl opened her eyes in surprise. Shielding his wife from unsolicited words and advice, Rush calmly asked how big a threat those monsters posed, and the high priest invited them to follow him. Amos asked if the Archduke would mind if his wife waited in the chambers, and Syria quickly agreed. The blonde man turned to his wife and asked if she would mind being here alone for a bit. Standing surrounded by a squad of knights and servants, the girl blushed, comparing her skin color to the skin of a tomato. She hissed that she was not a child, but sterna, and should not be treated like a little one, and Rush calmly objected, saying that this was a very dangerous place. Raising the tent flaps, the man grinned at the corner of his lips and said that they would see each other very soon, calling Syria his precious mistress right in front of everyone. Blushing again and looking embarrassedly after her husband, the blue-eyed woman rubbed her cheek with her hand, silently pondering why a surge of tenderness had suddenly come over him. Later, she spent time quietly in the already prepared huge tent and reflected on what was happening. Sitting on the bed, the Duchess reflected that somewhere nearby were Lena and Callus, and she would give anything to never cross paths with them. The girl barely had time to think that the saint had become stubble, and therefore they would still have to see each other before the mission, when suddenly the brunette ran into the tent and said that she had heard everything. Looking up at her with her yellow eyes, Lena asked if Syria had really come to save her from the monsters. The saint clenched her palms and asked if the Archduchess really wanted to do this, despite all her past actions, and the blue-eyed one froze, not understanding what she was saying. The girl stood up as the brunette continued her monologue, for some unknown reason telling how scared she was of the appearance of all these dark creatures. Wanting to get rid of the rather annoying Lena as quickly as possible, Syria said that she had arrived here as a stubble since she had been called for help. Despite the Archduchess's words that the high priest himself was here, whose call for help she could not ignore, the brunette declared that it did not matter. Having looked her interlocutor over from head to toe, she stopped her gaze with tenacious yellow eyes on the necklace and asked what this unusual decoration was. Not understanding why the thing could have interested Lena, the blue-eyed girl thought in a slight panic that everything was different in the book. When the saint pointed her finger inappropriately and asked about the origin of the necklace, Syria mentally tried to shield herself from her and calmly replied that it was given to her by Rush. The brunette hummed understandingly and asked if this was a wedding gift from the Archduke. Lena suddenly put her hand to her lips, continuing to examine the girl's necklace, and suddenly said that she wanted to get the same one for herself. The blue-eyed girl froze in surprise, unconsciously covering the necklace with her hand and not understanding how the saint could even calmly say such things out loud. The brunette muttered something about a wedding gift and then suddenly screamed, as if she had found the answer to her question, and raised her head. She folded her hands together, and not just with a smile, but with a sly grin, asked if this was a wedding gift. Then when they divorced, would Syria return it to the Duke? Clutching the decoration in her palm and looking at Lena as if she were crazy, the girl opened her wide blue eyes in bewilderment, amazed at the depth of human impudence. At the same time, while Archduke Rush was busy preparing for a clash with the monsters, the saint's husband approached the Duchess's tent. The servant who stood at the entrance noticed him, stood at attention, and hastily greeted the not very positively disposed Marquis of Hanet. The fair-haired youth asked if Mrs. Syria was in, and the servant answered in the affirmative, but he hesitated nervously and stuttered. Suddenly, Callus heard Lena's voice asking if the blue-eyed girl would return something to the Duke after the divorce. He lifted the tent flaps to enter, while the girl looked at her interlocutor in shock, not understanding whether she had always been like this. The brunette smiled, but the things she said were not just irritating, but also frightening, and this behavior was not at all like a book character. Syria picked up the necklace and smiled, saying that Lena seemed to want to get her hands on this piece of jewelry. The saint folded her fingers together, and without taking her eyes off the girl, explained that it was simply very beautiful. Not wanting to stop her completely incomprehensible behavior, the brunette continued to beg for the necklace, asking if the Archduchess would give it to her if she got bored with it. She fell silent and swallowed quietly from excitement, only when she heard her husband's familiar voice calling her to finally come to her senses. A gloomy Callus asked how she could even allow herself to speak so openly and calmly about the divorce of two aristocrats of the Gyrox Empire. Lena quickly turned to her husband and declared that everything was not at all as it seemed to him, finally turning away from Syria. The brunette explained that she said all this because when they divorced, Rush would also dissolve the marriage with his wife so that the couple could get back together. Marquis Hanet ran his hand through his hair and said that even so, all those words sounded vile. Turning around, the saint muttered that she understood everything, lowering her head to hide her bright red cheeks and tears, and then quickly walked out of the tent. Syria couldn't understand why she had to witness a family quarrel at all when the young man turned around and called her name, awkwardly ruffling his hair. Getting on the girl's nerves, he said that she seemed to have lost a little weight since their last meeting. Turning away, the blue-eyed girl calmly said that it was none of his business and that he should go to Lena, and Callus called out to her, wanting to talk. Their not very successful conversation was interrupted by the cries of people outside that the monsters were already here, and the young people turned to him. The knights fought valiantly against the monsters, and Elliot shouted, ordering his fighters not to go beyond the boundaries of the territory where Stern's forces were active. Looking at everything that was happening from a high ledge that overlooked the entire battle, Syria thought that there were many more monsters than she had expected. Putting her palms together, the girl began to concentrate so that her powers within a radius of 5 kilometers could reach the steel of the constellation from which the knight's armor was made. Closing her eyes, she mentally thanked the goddess for the knowledge that the true heroine had received remained in her memory, and also hoped that Lena would be out of reach. Stern suddenly heard someone calling her and turned around, seeing too late a huge red monster in front of her, its mouth already wide open. She fell to her knees and closed her eyes, preparing herself for intense pain. But suddenly, Marquis Hanet appeared between her and the monster, drawing his sword. Breathing heavily, Syria continued to sit on the ground as the knights led the monster away and fought with it, pointing at each other to protect the lady. Having ordered the fighters to deal with the creature, Callus turned to her, exhaled loudly, and asked if the girl was okay. Suddenly, a loud roar was heard, and another monster rushed towards the blonde one, opening its mouth, and the blue-eyed one noticed this too late, screaming loudly. This time, Rush arrived in time, jumping on the monster from behind and piercing it through with his deadly sword. He landed on the ground, still pushing the tip deeper to leave no chance for his enemy to escape, while Marquis Hanet looked on. Sheathing his weapon, the Archduke stood up and spat out with disgust and anger that Callus was not even able to take care of himself. Seeing her husband, Syria exhaled with relaxation and called him by name, feeling a pleasant warmth spreading through her soul at just one look at him. The Archduke declared that everyone here was crazy because they could only talk and not provide any real security for Sterna, and then headed towards his wife. Tucking her hair behind her ear, the blue-eyed girl repeated the name with a bright smile, and asked how he even knew she was in danger. Without answering the question or asking any questions, Rush grabbed her tightly with his arms, lifting her off the ground and pressing her fragile body into his strong chest. With one hand squeezing the girl's waist and the other burying himself in her hair, the man whispered loudly that he felt danger, felt that he could lose her at any moment. Syria blushed brightly and whispered that she was still here and would continue to be here if he didn't strangle her in his arms after she remained unharmed. Pressing his forehead into her fragile shoulder, Rush whispered hotly that if she had died, he would have buried alive all the nobles who had asked them for help. Stepping back a little, the Archduke asked worriedly what he would have done if he had not managed to arrive in time. What could have happened then? The blue-eyed girl froze, feeling his strong hands squeezing her shoulders, and blushed brightly, because for the first time he showed his emotions so clearly in public. She sheepishly asked him to stop, since there were knights and others around them, but the man sighed, reminding her that everyone knew about their status as spouses. The Marquis of Hainaut stood and looked from afar at this picture, clearly not intended for strangers to see, but placed right before him. He wondered in his mind when the two had managed to become so close, while the Archduke and Syria were joking with each other and seemed like real newlyweds. Callus gripped the hilt of his sword and wanted to stop all this, but a familiar high voice called his name. Lena ran up to him and excitedly asked what had happened to his arm, and the young man only now felt an unpleasant tingling sensation and warm blood on the wound above his elbow. Marquis Hainaut said that she should return to her position while the brunette tried to figure out if he was injured, and Rush muttered quietly that she was crazy to leave her place in the line. While the priests were taking Lena away to prevent her from ruining the entire monster-killing operation, the girl called out to Callus, constantly turning around to look at him. Another specially trained person was healing the young man's wound at the same time, so that he could later continue the battle in peace. He looked back at Syria again, only to see her look of disdain and indifference. Later, High Priest Amos scolded Lena, saying that they had been educating her every free minute, while the girl, with her head down, tried to quietly object to him. The man screamed. How many times did he need to be told that the Sterns played a key role during the fight with the monsters, and they should never leave their knights? Ashamed of her actions, the brunette hung her head, while Amos shouted that you can't leave because of one person, no matter what kind of relationship they have. Looming over Lena like a thundercloud, the high priest asked what would happen if, during her absence, the knights of House Burke began to freeze to death. The brunette quietly asked for forgiveness for her actions, and Amos urged her to control herself at least for one day, until the end of this operation. When the man left, the girl was left alone with her thoughts and gritted her teeth, not understanding what she had done wrong. She quietly asked why she was being treated like this, because Syria, if she were in her place at that moment, would have done exactly the same thing. Wiping away the tears of anger and shame, Lena thought vindictively that both she and the high priest would definitely experience the same disgusting feelings. Meanwhile, Abigail walked across the battlefield, shaking the still hot blood of many slain creatures off her sword. Looking back, the girl thought that she had already moved much further away from the camp as a whole and from her mistress than she should have. Suddenly, her fighting companion called out to the girl, telling her to turn around and wait for a blow from the right. The knight wanted to answer in surprise that there was nothing there, but then a huge monster, standing on its hind legs, attacked her from a completely different direction. Having dealt with the monster, Abigail threw away her sword and turned to the fighter, stating that something seemed wrong here. Feeling warm blood running down her temple, the girl clenched her teeth and asked what he was planning. The knight swallowed nervously, frozen in place, and then stuttered and asked again, as if not understanding what she meant. Grabbing him by the chest, the dark-haired woman asked sternly, again menacingly asking why he was deliberately taking her as far away from Stern as possible. When the young man began to tremble in fear and did not know how to justify himself, Abby shook him, trying to find out why he was pretending to help her. Remembering the knight's face that was looking at her, the dark-haired girl called him a scoundrel, saying that he was constantly hanging around St. Lena, suggesting that it was she who had put him up to it. At the same time, the brunette came out of the tent and walked down the street with a smile, mentally wondering if the knight had done what she asked. The girl remembered with a smile how she had only to smile and make eyes at the young man, and he had immediately agreed, and she thought about why everyone in the world was so good. Suddenly the saint saw Archduke Rush walking straight towards her, as always stern and gloomy, but very attractive. As they walked past each other indifferently, Lena brushed her hand against the man's strong shoulder. An incomprehensible energy flashed between them, as if it had shocked them both with electricity. Grabbing her hand, the brunette froze in surprise halfway, not understanding what kind of feeling had just pierced her entire being. Calling the girl by her title, Archduke Burke asked why she did this, feeling a wound on his forearm that appeared out of nowhere. Turning around, Lena swallowed and quietly asked him what he meant and smiled nervously, muttering that she hadn't done anything. The man asked her very sternly how she would explain it then, showing a fresh, gaping, bleeding wound on his arm. The brunette said in confusion that it was not true because she did not want or do anything like that. Casting an irritated and even angry glance at her, he turned around and expressed the hope that in the future the saint would no longer bother him. Lena, folding her hands together, looked after him, lost and frightened, immediately forgetting where she was going and what she was doing before this collision. Hugging herself by the shoulders, the girl thought that the Archduke's behavior even made her shudder. The brunette looked after the man, imagining how strict he could be with his own wife and loved ones. Turning away and rubbing her chin with her fingers, Lena decided that she had made the right choice earlier, and Callus was the best option. When the girl entered the high priest's tent, she froze and clenched her fists, looking at the situation with fear. Near the table, on his knees, sat the very knight from whom the saint had previously asked for help, and it was clear that he had been caught and had given up their entire plan. Amos, pointing his palm at the young man, asked if he had really been sent by the saint to Abigail to prevent her from protecting her mistress. Frozen, Lena trembled with fear of exposure just like the knight, trying to mumble something, but no excuses came to mind. The brunette asked His Eminence to understand her actions correctly, but the man screamed, calling on God and asking what kind of correctness we could talk about here. Lowering her head and hiding her eyes that were filled with tears, Lena said that she wanted to show that anyone would leave their post for someone they cared about, even Syria. The blue-eyed girl folded her arms across her chest, looking at her in surprise and even shock, not understanding why the hell she was taking Abigail away, risking her life, just for such a trifle. The Archduchess looked at the saint, who was now crying like an innocent lamb, although she knew perfectly well that a knight who went beyond the radius of divine magic could easily die. Amos turned away and said that he could no longer turn a blind eye to such actions, and then said that he took back his earlier words about letting him go to the capital after a month of training. Frightening and surprising the brunette at the same time, the high priest explained to the girl that she would remain in the Supreme Church. Lena screamed desperately that she hated this place, and the man stood up and slammed the table, saying that her first priority was her own sense of comfort, and therefore she treated the life of a knight with astonishing frivolity. Abby and Syria listened silently as the brunette screamed that this knight had also been imprisoned, and the man strongly advised her not to insult Sterna's personal knight. Turning around, the girl went to the exit and shouted that they did not understand anything because she only wanted to open their eyes to the truth. The brunette quickly ran out of the tent, ignoring the angry shouts of High Priest Amos. Covering his face with his hand, the man groaned loudly from irritation and how many problems the saint managed to bring to the ranks of the aristocracy. Leaning her palms on the table, the Archduchess rose from her seat and asked permission to speak with Lena. Sitting among the rocks and burying her palms in her knees, the brunette cried and thought that it was unfair because she should be the precious Sterna, but everyone only scolded her. Raising her wet gaze with deep yellow eyes, the girl silently wondered what she had done wrong and whether it would be better to blame the one who had brazenly taken her place. The saint suddenly felt some kind of insanely attractive call of power, telling her that she should receive much more divine power. Lena raised her head at the call and saw a golden necklace covered with large rubies. Looking at it and feeling her brain being enveloped in an incomprehensible haze clouding her consciousness, she mentally muttered that this thing belonged to Ceres. The decoration itself asked her to touch it, to reach out and take it for herself, and the brunette obediently extended her hand forward. When she squeezed the necklace with her fingers, it was as if an electric shock had pierced her, and dark purple and black shackles of magical energy appeared around her, bursting into her body. Syria, who was staring in surprise at everything that was happening, sank to the ground, but the unfamiliar magical power did not disappear from her. The blue-eyed girl froze in fear, her mouth wide open in surprise, and quietly asked what was going on here. She stepped towards the girl, deciding that she had to help with this strange condition, while the saint was breathing heavily, holding on to her own dress. When Lena looked up, Syria, with fear and confusion about what might come next, assumed that she had absorbed the darkness. Suddenly jumping up from her seat, the brunette rushed forward, staggering, and began to run away from the Archduchess. Looking after her, the blue-eyed girl, completely confused about what was happening, thought that she should call High Priest Amos as quickly as possible. When everyone reported to Rush, he said that she was simply mocking them. It was not enough for her to try to kill the Knight of Sterna. Now she also ran away. The Archduke looked up with fury at the clergyman who had given him all the news and asked what they wanted from him now. The young man bowed his head and asked forgiveness from his lordship, saying that this was an important matter, so they asked him to give them some knights to help. When someone entered the tent, the messenger reported that the situation was urgent, and therefore the high priest had already gone to look for the saint together with Lady Syria. Behind him, Elliot swallowed nervously as Rush flinched with rage, his voice seething with anger as he asked again if he had heard correctly. Clutching the scroll in his hands and trying to fight the urge to strangle someone, he asked if they really had allowed Syria to go looking for Lena herself. As the Archduchess and the high priest walked forward, looking for the brunette, the man said that no matter how much he lectured the girl, it all ended the same way. Walking a little further away, the blue-eyed girl mentally thought about what happened to the saint then, while Amos shouted and called her. She clutched the skirt of her dress, wondering if the girl had tried to clear out that dark energy, thinking that in the book that hadn't happened. After 15 minutes, they finally found Lena, who was walking quickly towards the forest. The brunette turned around when she heard the high priest's response, but clearly didn't try to come to her senses and stopped to discuss everything that had happened and returned to the camp. She screamed at them to stay back and said she had done nothing wrong, and Amos held out his hands and said they knew, but they had to leave this place first. The man tried to gently explain that if Lena gave up her position, she would start having problems. Syria stood behind them, trying to decide if she should tell Amos what she had just seen. Suddenly, a large monster jumped out of the forest, and the blue-eyed girl screamed, calling out to his eminence in fear. Meanwhile, Rush, surrounded by his knights, tried to find the high priest and his wife as quickly as possible, who were nowhere to be seen. Thoughtfully looking at the sky and the gradually setting sun, the Archduke thought with fear that with the onset of night, the search would be much more difficult. Suddenly, the Marquis of Hanet called to his lordship, attracting his attention, and then asked if any more traces of Syria had been discovered. Rush gripped the horse's reins with his hands and angrily declared that at a moment like this, the young man should not be so worried about her at all. He asked if common sense had completely abandoned both him and the saint, adding that it was they who had dragged the Archduchess into such a dangerous place. The man growled, wondering how he could continue to cause trouble and how long it could go on, and then wanted to say something else, but didn't have time. Both young men turned around when one of the knights called out to His Majesty and said that a monster had appeared very close by. The monster stood directly in front of the trio and growled, rubbing the ground with its paws and dropping saliva on it in anticipation of the already planned attack. Trying to save the saint, Amos ran towards her and held his hands out in front of her, urging her to run towards him so that they could escape the demonic creature. The monster rushed forward faster than the man could cover Lena, and strong paws with sharp claws pinned him to the ground. Reaching forward, Amos whispered hoarsely that the saint must save herself immediately, knowing that he would not make it out alive. The monster swung its huge clawed paw with a loud roar, and in place of the high priest's head, there remained only a bloody mess. Lena, shocked by what she saw, froze in place, unable to move due to paralyzing and all-encompassing fear, and Syria tried to shout to her. The monster that had just brutally dealt with Amos had no intention of stopping and screamed just as threateningly, swinging at Lena. Suddenly, Rush appeared near them, flew up, preventing the tragedy, and chopped off the head and paw of the monster with one blow of his sword. Looking at the saint, the Archduke breathed heavily, and covered in someone else's blood, said that he seemed to have expressed himself clearly when he ordered her to stop causing endless trouble. The brunette, pale and scared half to death, sank to her knees and could hardly breathe looking at her savior. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes as the girl gathered all her strength into a fist and, in a cherished voice, thanked the man for saving her. Suddenly, the moon lit up brightly again and increased in size just as it had during the saint's first disappearance, as if warning everyone about it. Syria shouted her husband's name loudly, and the Marquis called for the saint when all the people realized that something dangerous was about to happen. The brunette screamed loudly as the force entangled her from head to toe, lifting her off the ground and asking for help, looking at Rush. Reaching out her hand to him and screaming in fear, Lena repeated her request, not wanting to disappear from this world again. The Archduke only managed to reach out for her hand with his own when the moon finally absorbed the girl, taking her to another dimension. The man froze in place, looking at the sky in shock, because he had not seen the first disappearance of the saint, and therefore had no idea what it looked like from the outside. Syria clenched her fists and froze, realizing that this had just happened for the second time. The first moment in the book she disappeared for a short time, but the next moment was different because she was gone from their world for a whole year. During this time in the original story, both men, Callus and Rush, realized their love for Lena, even though they had not noticed it before. Pressing her hand to her mouth in fear, the blue-eyed girl thought that perhaps she had avoided the events, because the place and circumstances of the disappearance were completely different. Only one thing was constant. Just like in the book, Saint Lena and Rush reached out to each other before she disappeared. She cowered in panic fear, realizing that now the foundation could be laid for her to lose her own husband. The fair-haired man looked around, and noticing his wife's frightened state, calmly called her by name. Syria stood in front of him and couldn't understand what to do now. Would she just have to watch the story unfold? Blue-Eyed didn't want to lose Rush so much that she practically felt on a physical level the pain she would experience if she suddenly lost his care and warmth. Standing before him, pressing her hands to her chest, she wondered if she could avoid a future where her husband falls in love with the saint and the girl dies. A little later, the high priest was brought to his tent, and they tried to put him in order, laying him in a coffin so that every person could say goodbye to him. As Syria walked hesitantly and slowly into the tent, one of the men in a priest's robe thanked her. He pinched the bridge of his nose with his hands and said that since a stern like her had prayed for the peace of Amos's soul, he must now be in the arms of God. Rush approached his wife and put his hand on her fragile shoulder, asking what she was doing there, and the blue-eyed woman replied that she had come to place a lock of her hair on the lid of the priest's coffin. Holding the already cut locks of hair in her hands, the girl muttered that she knew about the sign according to which this was good for the deceased. Taking her hair from her fragile palm, the Archduke said that it would be better for him to do it himself with his wife's permission, since it would be better for her not to see Amos in such a state, and then he stepped forward. Syria came out of the tent and looked at the tired and wounded soldiers, thinking that they looked pathetic, and this was not surprising after all the events. When she and Rush were both standing on the street and looking at the white doves, the girl couldn't remember whether the high priest had died in the novel itself. The only thing she knew was that Lena had not disappeared here. In the book, the saint had followed the Archduke to a frozen lake in the Berklands and had suddenly disappeared. In the novel, the man felt guilty for not being able to save her, and over time, this feeling grew into genuine love. Syria hesitantly called her husband and quietly asked if he felt guilty for everything that had happened here. Rush didn't quite understand this question, trying to clarify before whom or her he should feel guilty. Immediately thinking that she had started all this in vain, she muttered that the question was inappropriate and asked to forget about it, and the fair-haired man asked how he could answer if he did not fully understand what was wanted from him. The blue-eyed girl turned around and quietly exhaled when her husband really asked her to finish and explain everything. Gathering her courage, she asked him if he felt guilty for what had happened to Saint Lena, and the Archduke froze upon hearing these words. Rush asked if she was sure she meant him, and when Syria said that he understood everything absolutely, and there was no point in asking clarifying questions, the man shrugged, saying that he had not expected such a question. The fair-haired man said that he didn't quite understand his wife, and whether she was really worried that he might be tormented by different feelings, and the blue-eyed woman quietly replied that that's exactly what she felt. Suddenly, Rush's hand was on her face, and he used his thumb to gently smooth out the wrinkle that lay between the girl's eyebrows. He said with a smile that he now understood why she frowned, and Syria blushed slightly, looking at him. Stroking the girl's forehead gently and affectionately, the Archduke stated that when she was thoughtful, the corners of her eyebrows on the bridge of her nose were slightly raised. The blue-eyed girl turned away, blushing brightly, and said that there was nothing like that, but the fair-haired man explained that you could always tell what she was feeling from her facial expression. The girl bit the inside of her cheek when Rush said that the saint herself decided to escape from the camp. He did not force her to leave, and therefore did not feel any guilt. Syria thought back to the plot of the novel, in which their love had flared up precisely after this, and thought about how desperately she had tried to avoid it. The most offensive thing for the blue-eyed girl was the fact that because of the way she moved the pieces on the board, an innocent man, Amos, paid with his life. Later, when the girl was sitting on a bench and thinking about the horrors that had happened, a loud child's voice called out to her. The priest's little assistant handed her a glass of wine, saying that it was an offering in honor of the deceased, and that she asked her to accept it. Having thanked the little girl and taken the glass in her hands, she squeezed it with her fingers and thought that she had never been able to fully explain her feelings to Rush. Then, during their short conversation, he decided that her worries were caused mainly by the great shock of seeing the death of the high priest, and also asked her to prepare for a quick departure to the castle. The girl shook her head thoughtfully, wondering if he was offended, and then decided that she should apologize and raised her glass of red wine to her lips to honor Amos's memory. Sniffing the scent, she seemed to sense something unpleasantly familiar, but she didn't immediately understand what it was. At that moment, Callus took her hand with the glass in his own and quietly called the girl by name, asking her not to drink it. Syria asked in surprise what he was doing there, and Marquis Hunnick took the wine from her and handed her a large flask, saying that it would be much better if she took this. Handing the vessel back to the young man, the blue-eyed girl said that she could manage and asked for her cup back, but the fair-haired man poured out the drink, saying that he could not. Hearing the surprised and muffled sounds squeezed from the girl's lips, he explained that the red wine was made from strawberries, to which she was allergic. Callus turned around and walked the other way, asking Syria to keep the flask, but she stood up and screamed, asking where he was going and repeating that she didn't need the thing. The Marquis said that in that case she could just throw it away, and suddenly Sir Eliot called out to the blue-eyed girl waving the flask. He said he had finished preparing the carriage and had come to take it away, and then asked where the flask had come from, and the Archduchess hastily replied that it had come from some tramp. The knight hesitantly objected, saying that it belonged to the Marquis of Hanet, and Syria blushed brightly and asked in surprise how he knew. Eliot pointed to the design engraved on the vessel and explained that it depicted the family crest of the House of Callus. Syria immediately thought that the Marquis had almost set her up, because if someone else, and not her loyal knight, had noticed the thing, there would have been a huge scandal. When the young man asked what was in it, the Archduchess said that it contained wine, since it was prepared by priests, and she could not drink it because of an allergy. Sir Eliot straightened up, and his face changed, looking at his lady with a little apprehension. He muttered that Archduke Rush would be upset when he found out about this, and the blue-eyed girl asked, a little confused, why he would be upset. The fair-haired man replied that it did not matter, and then added that he began to understand why his lordship was always asking his wife to accompany him, and she objected that they hardly spoke to each other. She said that she would return the flask to him and called the priest's little assistant, and the girl immediately turned around when she heard the lady. Syria handed the flask to the little girl and gently asked her to pass it on to Marquis Hanet, and she held out her small hands in agreement. She promised that she would take it right away, but a familiar male voice suddenly asked what and to whom she was going to take it, and then deftly snatched the flask from the girl's hands. Pressing his back against his wife and squeezing her shoulder with his free hand, Rush growled irritably in her ear, scorched by a feeling of burning jealousy. He exhaled, causing goosebumps to appear on the girl's neck, and asking if that bastard had really been flirting with her again. Callus had meanwhile already reached his tent and entered, pushing aside the curtain with his hand while the servant greeted my lord. The assistant reported that an urgent message had arrived from the Supreme Church, and the young man replied that if they were eager to know when he would arrive, they could tell him that they would not have to wait long, since he was planning to leave today. The servant called out to my lord again, and when he turned round, he said that they had asked for the arrival not only of the Marquis, but also of a witness to what had happened. The blond man asked why this was necessary, and the man explained that the saint herself had disappeared, so this case would be investigated very thoroughly. He added that someone with divine power, who was present at the time of the saint's disappearance, must come. Callus immediately thought of Syria, who was there and saw everything perfectly, and therefore would be suitable as a witness. The aide added that the elders held an urgent meeting and decided that it was Sterna who should testify at the hearing. The Marquis of Hanet asked if he should deliver it, but the assistant shook his head, saying that the priest would do it themselves. He added that the young people would hardly be happy with each other's company, and therefore special people would do everything possible to ensure that they did not cross paths, and the fair-haired man quietly muttered his agreement. Suddenly, Rush's voice was heard, calling out to the Marquis and entering the tent without permission. He threw the flask he had given his wife at the young man with all his might, and he managed to catch it right in front of his face, swallowing. The Archduke folded his arms and asked them to continue their conversation calmly, while the servant asked in confusion what was going on. The man looked at them with the most contemptuous gaze he could muster, sternly asking who and where they had decided to take them without permission. The servant explained that the senior priest had already gone to his tent to notify him personally, but Burke asked whose authority it was to give such orders. Walking closer to them, He clenched his fists and declared that his wife had already overcome many difficulties on the way home and did not have time to walk around the church. Callus looked at him irritably, feeling a twinge of jealousy when Rush mentioned Syria in such a context. The Archduke said that if they needed someone with divine power, he would go himself, since he was part of the Grand Vanchette, so there should be no problem, and the servant confirmed this. The Marquis suddenly asked how much work he had assigned to Syria, if she didn't even have time to go to church, and forcing her to work until exhaustion was too much. Smiling, Rush said with a cold-blooded smile that he was incredibly grateful for how much my lord cared about his wife. While finishing off Callus, the Archduke calmly, with a hidden caustic jab, said that, given his constant spending time with the saint before, he believed that his attitude towards Syria was exactly like that. He gritted his teeth, lowering his head and clutching the one that had been handed back to him in such an impudent manner. A little earlier, Rush told the blue-eyed girl to give him this flask, and she doesn't need it, because there is warm wine in the kitchen. He pointed his finger at the tent, telling his wife to get something good from there, not this swill, and she turned to him, a little surprised. The girl explained that she couldn't drink the local wine because it was made from strawberries, which would make her sick. Elliot, who was present at the conversation, felt even more awkward when Syria said that Rush could not have known this, since she never talked about it. Blue-eyed, not wanting to offend him, said that they had spent so little time with each other, and therefore she had not had time to share a lot. Then the man thought with a twinge of jealousy how funny it was that the Marquis knew more about the Archduchess than the Archduke himself. He frowned and wondered if it was really just a matter of time, that she had simply known Callus longer. Rush, with a rage in his soul that refused to be silenced, was not sure if it was only because of this damn time that the Marquise's face distorted every time he heard her name. Stepping even closer, the man asked the milord to wake up and said that he seemed to have forgotten that his wife was Saint Lena and not Syria. But the Marquis stated that the two couples had simply gotten married due to unforeseen circumstances. Rush countered that things were different with the blue-eyed girl, and he personally never ran away from his bride during the wedding for an affair with another. Callus, hearing these words, shouted at his lordship, trying to call for an end to the conflict. The young man, his fingers gripping the hilt of his sword, asked the Archduke if he would stop throwing insults if he were challenged to a duel right now. Grabbing his weapon, the man smiled and said that he had finally received a worthy offer, and the servant cried out in fear. He squeezed the gentleman's hand with his palms and asked him to calm down, because something bad could happen, and Rush, with a grin, said that bad was what he needed. The assistant called to hear about the lady and said that he was sure that the girl was already very worried about the monstrous death of the high priest. Both men stopped when he added that this dangerous duel could finish off the girl. Rush muttered that his assistant had a good head on his shoulders for a reason, and then said that they would have to wait with this desired duel. Seeing the end of this tense conversation, Sir Elliot approached and asked in fear what his master and the Marquis were going to do. But the Archduke calmly replied that it was none of his business. Stepping towards his knight, he asked if everything was ready, and when the young man answered in the affirmative, he ordered that fighters be selected to return back to the duchy, while the rest would have to go with him to the temple. The man smiled thoughtfully and called Elliot by name, making another request, and the leader of the knights asked what was the matter. Rush said that he had to make sure that all the strawberries in the main garden of his estate were torn out completely and by the roots. The knight suggested that he could speak with the lady about this, and the Archduke asked, puzzled, why this was necessary. Teasing Callus, during a discussion of internal matters, the fair-haired man said with a smile that he was not sure if his wife knew that no one else could torment him as much as she could. The Marquis froze, hearing how they were discussing the already well-established life of this union, which was supposed to become just a formality. He was absolutely certain that the look, words, and behavior of the Archduke indicated that Rush was absolutely in love with Syria. Upon returning to the main estate, surrounded by Abigail and Elliot, the blue-eyed one froze and asked if she was dreaming all this. With her arms wide open and looking in shock at the garden that had been dug up from top to bottom, which had been pristinely untouched before their departure, the girl asked what had happened here. Abby said that the estate seemed to have been robbed, and when the lady asked what kind of thief would dare to break into the Burke house, she suggested that the robber could be one of the servants. Drawing her sword, the dark-haired girl was clearly in a serious mood and asked the Archduchess for permission to find and destroy the villains. When they entered their native palace, the blue-eyed one waved her hand and said that this was wrong. At the entrance, she was met by Bastian, surrounded by a dozen maids, who bowed and greeted her ladyship, saying that she was expected at home. The girl looked at the man with a smile, saying that everything seemed to be in order in the estate. But what happened in the courtyard, in the main garden? To Syria's surprise, the butler said that they thought the strawberries had grown too much, and so they had to dig everything up to get every single root. Blue Eyes said that even in that case, she saw no reason to leave the garden in that state, and Bastian bowed, asking for forgiveness, and explaining that the fact was that gardeners, according to custom, obey only the orders of the Archduchess. He added that, according to tradition, this area is the property of the mistress of the House of Burke. But since they did not have a mistress before, the gardeners refused to make major changes to the layout of the garden. Pointing to the dug-up area, Bastian asked why she didn't take the opportunity to give this beautiful part of the estate a new look. Placing her hand on her chest, Syria said that she had very little understanding of such things, but she would try, and the butler replied with a smile that he was very grateful. Tapping her fingers against her lips, the girl muttered that there was no reason to stick to any particular schedule, but it would be nice to have everything planned out before Rush arrived. Smiling happily, the blue-eyed girl said that from now on, it seemed like they had a lot of things to do. A few days later, the Archduchess was already resting at Laurel Manor, explaining to Martha why she had been sent there for a while. Marta asked why they wanted to send her away, and Syria, offended, said that she had simply worked very hard. She said that she had put the gardeners who had tried to deceive her, and by extension the entire Burke household, in their place, and had ordered them to thoroughly fertilize the soil. Later, she carefully studied 24 garden design proposals and selected the most beautiful ones at reasonable prices. Bastian said that everything had already been done for the main estate and asked the lady to go to the Laurel estate. He said that the Archduchess managed to finish it in 3 days, although he wanted it to become a relaxing hobby for her. The girl sipped her tea, remembering the butler's words about the garden at Laurel's estate being smaller, so she would be able to enjoy decorating it. She immediately looked up and realized that she had indeed been sent into exile because she had worked too hard, and Martha said that Bastian had been right in his words. The woman hugged the lady and said that she had indeed lost weight and could therefore come to them on the weekend to enjoy delicious food, and Syria admitted that this sounded wonderful. Martha laid her head on the crown of her beloved Archduchess and said that His Highness could also come sooner to rest. Gently stroking the girl's chin, she smiled and expressed her hope that the gentleman would find a place where his heart could rest. After a few days spent visiting Martha, the Archduchess was traveling back to the main estate to finally meet with Rush, who had returned from his trip to the High Church. As she sat in the carriage, she thought about Lena appearing in a year, and she wondered in her mind if Rush would give her his heart after he returned. Stroking her pounding temples, the girl thought about how she seemed to be prepared for any turn of events, but Callus's betrayal hit her harder than she thought. Remembering the darkness that had taken over Lena, she stroked her necklace and thought that they were completely different, since Syria could only purify demonic energy by borrowing the power from this ornament. She remembered that Lena was able to perform miracles after receiving the necklace, but she never had any suspicions because the saint originally possessed a strong divine power, which, according to her, helped cleanse impurity. Thinking about it, Syria suggested that the necklace could be an item that could greatly enhance Sterna's magic. Putting her hands together and stroking the decoration, the blue-eyed girl wondered if it could be the source of all of Lena's power while she was simply deceiving everyone. The Archduchess rubbed her face with her hand, whispering that she was very tired of wondering whether she should continue to push further from the original plot. After some time, the carriage drove into the courtyard of the main estate, and the girl went out into the street, happy that the road had finally been overcome. Rush met her right there, still dressed in his formal attire, and smiled softly, calling his wife by name because he missed her. Blue-Eyed also smiled brightly, greeting the Archduke, and he asked where she had been if she had returned from her trip. Syria replied that she had gone to Laurel Manor for a couple of days, and then hugged his hand and asked how he had returned from the High Church so quickly, to which the man replied with a smile that he had galloped his horse all the way home. Touching his palm, which was not covered by clothes, the girl looked at her husband with fear, saying that he had a fever and seemed to be ill. Rush turned to her, asking if he looked like a sick person, and the blue-eyed girl answered a little hesitantly that anyone could get sick. The Archduke replied that perhaps that was so, but that he could not afford to be weak today, and Syria asked, puzzled, how one could treat it differently if he really had a fever. Later, when she wanted to discuss this issue with Lennon, he looked at her in surprise and said that this could not be, because as long as he remembered the gentleman, he was always in good health. Blue Eyes asked if he really had such good health, and the assistant said that was putting it mildly, since in this regard the Archduke was clearly not human. Thinking that if Lenin was talking about such things calmly, then everything was fine, the girl asked where his lordship was now, because she wanted to show him the plan of the future garden. The assistant replied that the gentleman was finishing his work in his chambers, since due to his hasty departure from the Supreme Church, he had many unresolved issues. Entering her husband's chambers with the medicine brought on a tray, Syria examined it and muttered that she knew it. Rush lay half sitting on the bed, suffering from fever, covered in letters and papers related to unresolved issues. Touching her husband's hot forehead, the girl thought that Lenin was incredibly naive if he allowed the Archduke to hide his every ailment so easily. The man woke up and caught the blue-eyed woman's hand, but she excitedly said that this would not work and that he needed to take medication to improve his condition. She quietly called his name when the Archduke remained silent, looking at her with a slightly unusual, very attentive gaze and breathing heavily. Syria asked if he was okay, gently squeezing his fingers a few times, and only then did Rush more or less come to his senses, looking up at her with a more conscious gaze. Pulling a chair up to his bed, she stated that she was sure he had a fever, although he tried to insist that there was no way he could be ill. Holding a small tablet in her palm, the blue-eyed girl explained that Suzette had given her this tablet for a cold, and that she should take it with water. Rush replied that he was afraid of melting the medicine with his touch, and Syria asked if he had felt a fever right away. The Archduke ignored the question and moved closer to the girl, muttering that he better not touch the pill, and asked for help. Before the surprised girl could answer, the man leaned over and pressed his lips to her palm, grabbing the medicine. Pulling away, he gently touched her fingers, taking the pill, and exhaled noisily, still not feeling his best. Syria blushed brightly from such a touch, and Rush whispered that if he did not wash down the medicine, a bitter taste would remain in his mouth, and so he asked for some water. Trying to convince herself and her body that there was no need to be embarrassed and nervous, because her husband was simply ill, she gently placed one hand on his chin, and with the other brought a glass of water to his mouth. A few cool drops of water rolled down the blond man's lips, cheeks, and neck, as he, like a child, informed Syria that she had spilled a little. Turning away, the girl told him not to complain, because few people could receive care from Sterna herself, and Rush sarcastically said that he would have to bow to her later. She put the glass on the nightstand and asked why she was working herself so hard during her illness, and the Archduke replied that she herself had worked so hard that she had managed to bring Bastian to tears. Blue-Eyed replied that at least she was not hiding her poor health, and besides, work in the garden would go slowly, and they would have to wait for spring, since the ground was still frozen. While the girl continued to chat about the garden, Rush turned his head and suddenly asked if he really looked so pathetic that she was forced to sit here with him for company. Clutching the skirt of her dress, Syria lowered her head, humming, and said that being sick could be very lonely. The man asked her if she knew this from experience, and if she had been treated badly at home, and the blue-eyed girl quickly corrected him that she was the only one who had treated them badly. The blonde man said that he had sent an envoy to her family to ask for their approval of their marriage after the year-end festival, but they had been slow to respond, and the girl assumed that they simply did not care about her marriage. Rush asked how then to explain the fact that they had almost immediately agreed to Marquis Hannett, and Syria explained that if Callus had been a duke, they would have found a lot of reasons to refuse. With her head down, she said that her family considered the girl unworthy of anything other than marriage with the Marquis, and they would never accept that she had become the wife of the Archduke. The man suddenly asked her to stop talking about it and covered the blue-eyed girl's clenched and intertwined fingers with his hot palm. Stroking her palms, he asked his wife to forget about the Keladins, because, in fact, this answer was not so important to him, and the blue-eyed woman asked why he had sent the messenger then. Remembering how Marquis Hannett had boasted about being the only man the Syria family would allow him to marry, Rush muttered that he had done it all because of that bastard. When the girl asked who he meant, the Archduke said that he had misspoke and asked his wife not to worry, as he simply wanted to observe all the formalities. The man suddenly decided to radically change the topic of conversation and asked if Syria was free tomorrow or the day after. The blue-eyed girl replied that, of course, she was free, asking why he was asking such questions, and the fair-haired man calmly replied that he wanted to go somewhere with her. He added that he wanted to take a walk with her to the frozen lake and look not only at the familiar northern side, but also to go to the much more picturesque southern side to relax, and the girl froze in surprise, looking at her husband. She asked if there might be monsters there, but Rush calmly replied that guests were always accompanied there by knights, so they would be completely safe. Reaching forward and taking her palm in his, the man stroked her soft skin and said that his wife especially shouldn't worry about anything, because he was nearby. Looking at the still red cheeks of the blonde man, Syria asked him to wait and postpone this walk at least until his fever went down. Noticing that even his eyes were red, the girl freed her hand from his fingers and touched his hot forehead, saying that he was clearly very ill. She asked worriedly if the temperature had risen even higher, and the man reminded her that his eyes were always very bright and red. When they were very close to each other, Rush whispered that she didn't seem to notice, then asked if it looked weird, and she denied it. Instantly realizing how close they were to a kiss, Syria pulled back, screaming that they had indeed always been red, wondering how she hadn't seen it before. Squeezing her hands again with his own, the Archduke repeated the question about a walk on the lake, calling his wife by name. No longer trying to fight the bright blush, the girl muttered that, of course, she would be happy to go there with him. A few days later, they actually went there to see a rare sight, a majestic lake covered with ice. Rush seemed even more attractive against this background, because his appearance played interestingly with the similar beauty of winter nature. Looking at his wife, who was holding a blue umbrella with frills, he asked how long she had loved this accessory. The girl explained that the maids had told her about how blinding the sun's light reflected off the glacier was, and that's why everyone really did walk around here with umbrellas. Blue Eyes remembered Suzette's words about people coming there to get acquainted with the heritage of their land in the Burke's territory. Then she listened with delight to how on a clear day, ladies take umbrellas with them, symbolizing the flowers blooming around the lake, and she also prepared to do everything as expected. Now, having heard such a question from the Archduke, Syria thought that it would have been better not to ask anything about the traditions of newlyweds. She pushed the umbrella aside and said that it seemed strange to her and that it would be better to put it away. But Rush suddenly asked why she should do that. Taking hold of the thin white handle of the umbrella, the man smiled softly and asked to leave it. Looking his embarrassed wife up and down, the fair-haired man shook his head and sighed sweetly. Without taking his eyes off Syria, he said that the maids were right, and the views here really could blind you with their radiance and beauty. The girl smiled brightly at such an obvious compliment and called her husband by name, gently wrapping her fragile palms around his elbow. Pulling him towards her and making her cheeks burn, the blue-eyed woman asked the man to stand under the umbrella with her because the sun was shining too brightly, and there was definitely enough room for the two of them. Smiling at his wife's coquettishness and tenderness, Rush obediently stood under the umbrella, pressing her to his side, and thanked her for her care. They were walking around the lake, and the girl said that people say that if you look at the glacier often, you can fall in love with the Duchy of Berk. The blonde-haired man asked with a smile who exactly was speaking like that, and the blue-eyed woman answered with a smile and enthusiasm that it was Suzette. The man asked if she felt this love, and Syria touched her head with her finger, reminding him that she was Sterna and knew what was on the other side of the glacier, and therefore she could not be moved by it. Shaking his head, Rush said with a smile that she remained a big mystery to him, and the girl jumped up, saying that she was like an open book to him. Blue Eyes asked where else he could find Sterna, who was so familiar with the glacier and all its features. Suddenly, they both fell silent, because they noticed huge black smoke that was thickening over the place and seemed to eclipse the sky itself. Looking at what was happening, Rush became as dark as a cloud, whispering that now was the time. The darkening was a phenomenon where the frozen lake would turn black every winter and then return to its normal appearance. But there were also times when monsters would appear around the lake along with the color change. As they walked through the garden a couple of days later, the Archduke told his wife that they would probably have to sit in the estate for the next week to see if any monsters would appear. The girl nodded, feeling sad, and then the man assured her that there was nothing to be afraid of, because in a week, everything would resolve itself. Syria clicked her tongue, asking if she looked scared, and Rush replied that he was just checking because she looked downcast even when they sat down to eat. He added that he would not like to see the girl cry again, and the blue-eyed girl frowned and asked if he really enjoyed making fun of her. The Archduke said with a smile that it was very much so, and the girl let go of his elbow, muttering that she had been so kind to take him to see the garden that he so wanted to see. Catching Syria and putting his arm around her shoulder as she said they should go back, Rush asked her not to be like that, and said he hadn't really had time to look at the design she had chosen. Pressing the blue-eyed girl to his side, he enthusiastically asked if she would explain everything to him while he walked, clarifying what they planned to do here. Stroking her chin, the girl replied that she had thought of planting an oak tree, but that might have been old-fashioned, and the man asked her to do things the way she saw fit. Slightly blushing at his words, Syria looked up, and looking at her husband from under her brows, asked how he would speak if she suddenly wanted to plant an oak tree on the roof of the estate. Rush smiled, looking at his wife with the same gaze, and rhetorically asked if he really had the right to contradict the Archduchess of the House of Burke. Turning around, the blue-eyed girl clicked her teeth because he didn't want to give in to her at all, and asked if she could then plant a tree right in his chambers. At first the man froze, looking at her in surprise, but after a few moments he laughed loudly, appreciating Syria's joke. Trying to remain serious and not to show that she had already forgiven his barbs, the girl nevertheless blushed and thought that her husband had been laughing a lot lately. She asked him if they could spend every weekend at Laurel Manor, and then added that she had promised Martha to visit her every week. Walking forward, the blue-eyed woman said that it would be nice if he went with her, but then she stopped short, saying that it would be difficult to leave now because of the darkened lake. Rush replied that there shouldn't be any problems, since the estate was very close, and they could easily spend time there. Their conversation was interrupted by the familiar loud cry of Lennon, who was rushing towards the young couple across the garden. Even as he stopped near them and panted from the long run, the assistant still called out to his mistress. He put his hands on his knees and, out of breath, said that a servant from the Kelladon scrapyard had arrived, and Rush asked what he could possibly need at such a late hour, and Lennon muttered that he wanted to deliver an obituary. After accepting the papers handed over, Syria read about the death of Mrs. Margris, whom she knew because this woman was the aunt of the original heroine. She never married or had children, but her long tenure as an elder gave her greater influence in society. The girl remembered that Margris was the only member of the family who did not dislike her. The lady loved the theater very much, and later treated everyone well, even the not very successful and famous actors. It was because of this fact that she did not experience any negative emotions or feelings towards the matter of Ceres, who was an artist. Syria muttered that her aunt must have left her an inheritance, so she would have to go to her parents' house, and Rush assured her that this was not necessary, since he could send Lennon instead. Putting the letter on the table, the blue-eyed woman said that he could not be forced to fulfill her personal whims, and then added that Marquis Kelladon asked her to come personally for a visit. Having moved into Syria's body, the girl first encountered her notorious family at one of the many balls. She knew she was on bad terms with her relatives, but she wanted to try to work things out now that she had the chance. But neither that evening nor later did anything come of it because of the arrogant and even harsh behavior of all these people. Blue-Eyed still remembered how she felt then, and it wasn't even anger, but fear so strong that it caused the lie. At that moment, she was unable to control her emotions, and as if for a few moments, she suddenly became the real Ceres with its problems and pain. Now the Archduchess rubbed her neck, thinking that she would like to test her strength again and try to control her feelings in the presence of the Kelladon family. Rush asked, a little annoyed, why they didn't wait a week. Then they could go together, and the girl stood up, asking with a sly smile if he was worried about letting her go there alone. Leaning towards her husband's ear, the blue-eyed woman said that if he was really worried, then could she ask him to do something for her? The Archduke obediently stood still, eager to listen to everything that Syria could tell him. When she finished, a loud questioning cry was heard in the office, which even some of the servants outside seemed to hear. The next morning the sun rose over the Kelladon estate, which was, of course, much more modest than the duchy, but not entirely devoid of taste in its execution. The assistant looked in on the red-haired young gentleman, informing him that the lady had arrived, and he rose from his seat, asking if this fool had really come here. The young man said that he was sure that she would be afraid of her father, and then asked what his brother was doing, and the butler replied that he was meeting the head of the House of Mensel and his wife. Looking outside, the red-haired man muttered that his father and mother must be busy too, and so he wondered whether he should go out and greet his relative. This young man with bright blue eyes and equally unusual fiery red hair was the second son of the House of Kelladon Nisus. As the Archduchess, flanked by Elliot and Abigail, stepped out of the carriage, the butler bowed to her and greeted Lady Syria Kelladon. Folding her arms across her chest, the blue-eyed girl smiled, saying that she and Jason, this servant, had not seen each other for a long time, and he had not changed at all. The man nodded with a smile, and then asked if the girl was doing well, and Syria folded her arms over her chest, muttering that she was fine, but only for a while. Frowning and drawing her eyebrows together, the blue-eyed girl sternly said that everything was fine until she was treated disrespectfully at home. When the butler hesitantly asked what she meant, the girl explained that she was no longer the Marquise of Kelladon, but the Archduchess of Burke. Blue-eyed added that, despite her high status, her procession had to enter not through the main gate, but through the side gate, and it was not family members who came out to greet her, but a simple servant. The man trembled in fear and tried to stutter to say something, but the blue-eyed woman asked if she really looked like a postman. Extending her index finger in an unusual gesture of sternness, Syria said that she would not repeat it twice, and then ordered him to return to the house and report the arrival of the lady. When the butler left, the girl, without turning around, called her knight and asked whether this, in her opinion, was blatant disrespect towards her. Abigail belligerently suggested breaking down the main gate, but the blue-eyed girl smiled, saying that in that case, she would have to pay compensation, and she did not want to give a penny to this family. Drawing her sword, the dark-haired girl said that she would cut the throat of anyone who dared to ask her for money, and Elliot held the girl tightly by the shoulder. Syria said that everything was fine when she noticed a familiar silhouette exiting the estate. She assured Evie that she would definitely tell her if she needed anything like that, and looked ahead with a frown, looking at the purple-haired boy who was saying something to the butler. This young man with an arrogant expression on his face was the eldest son of Marquis Keladon and Syria's half-brother. In simple terms, the Archduchess could have added him to the list of those relatives who had nothing but contempt and disrespect for her. Cassius looked up and, calling his sister by name, asked what devilish game she was playing. The dark-haired man shouted uncontrollably, wondering how much longer she intended to carry on with this nonsense. But the blue-eyed woman calmly asked him to watch his language, because she was no longer Kaladin, and now he was obliged to address his sister as Her Highness. The young man laughed and said that she had wanted a lot, and suggested that he kneel down to greet the noble person who had deigned to grace them with her presence. Stepping forward, Syria gave him a stern look, explaining that if he was going to meet her, he should do it properly, because the knights were watching them. She asked with a slight smile what good there was in displaying all the family problems in front of the representatives of the powerful House of Burke. Cassius turned his head with a sigh, and said that he had heard how badly his sister had been wounded, and that this had apparently greatly changed her disposition. Her stepbrother extended his hand to her to accompany her, and the blue-eyed girl did not know the reason, but she felt how fear woke up in every cell of her body next to this man. Pulling herself together, the girl thought that she had now become a completely different person, and therefore she had nothing to fear, and she placed her fingers in the young man's open palm, walking behind him. When they reached the corridor, the butler announced that the best guest room in the estate's annex had been prepared for the lady. Syria ordered that the bedroom be given to her accompanying knight, Abigail, and then the man froze, asking in surprise why she did not wish to stay there. Still working on the sternness of her voice, the blue-eyed one stated that there was no point in her using the guest room, since she had her own quarters in this palace. When the butler said that the room was not completely cleaned, the girl pointed to the maids who were getting nervous and asked why not order them to do something useful. The current Archduchess's old quarters were not just unkempt, they were abandoned, covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. Judging by the expression on the dark-haired Marquis's face as he asked what the hell was going on here, even he didn't know about such disrespect. Deciding to play on this family shame as well, Syria folded her arms across her chest and asked if her half-brother wanted to be surprised by something. Making him stand dumbfounded with shame, the Archduchess said that at the Burke estate, even the coachman's quarters were more decent. Turning to the butler, Cassius shouted that there seemed to be thieves among them, and then ordered that he find out who they were immediately after the funeral. Blue-eyed thought that this whole situation and her words had touched him to the quick, and she quietly muttered, "Did he really think that only he could be in a bad mood?" The girl froze when she heard the familiar voice of the knight commander, Elliot, calling for the lady. Entering inside, he said that he wanted to check the chambers that had been allocated to her, and therefore asked the servant to accompany him to the Archduchess. When Syria said that her room was located right here, Sir Elliot looked around the room in surprise and was clearly not happy about this fact. Smiling, the blue-eyed woman shook her head and assured her subject that such things would not upset her at all, because she had to get used to the good treatment in the Burke household, since it was not very usual. The fair-haired man sincerely replied that he personally was glad that the girl was now with them, and that, in his opinion, they were very lucky. The girl blushed when she heard that Elliot was very grateful that she had chosen the Burke estate, and he was sure that the others thought the same. The young man, with a gentle smile, suggested that the lady sort out the inheritance issues as soon as possible and return home, since everyone there was already waiting for her. The Archduchess blossomed with a bright smile and thanked the knight for his kind words, agreeing with them. A little later, Syria sat at the dinner table with the rest of the Keladon family. Blue-eyed listened to the girl's voice, who said that Mrs. Margress's death was very sudden, but many still managed to come. The blonde, with fair skin and lots of freckles, said that the deceased was a famous person, and everyone who was present there received mercy.